Hello, I'm James Pikeway,
I'm Paul Kelly.
and welcome to Know Your Audience, the micro mini podcast series. Paul, great to see you again.
Good to be back. Thanks, James. How you been?
And I'm doing really well.
That's
I've
good.
been unpacking everything we've been talking about, and now I'm constantly looking at grocery stores, I'm looking at retailers, and I'm trying to figure out what kind of research they've done to target their advertising, to target their aisle setup, to target their brochures at
Yeah.
me, and trying to
Yeah.
figure out if they've gotten it right. So,
Figure out who's gaming you.
exactly, and with that whole mindset in play, it just got me thinking that when we had an opportunity to sit back down, as we're doing now, to start thinking about this whole this whole universe of research that we've opened up the door to,
Yep.
and what gets in the way of every organization starting to adopt some level and some form of AI enabled data collection, because you know for a fact they're not doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting point, James, because I think there's quite a lot of reasons, but a lot of them are often just organizational and the lack of, I guess, embracing change, some skepticism towards probably well-founded, you might say, skepticism towards some versions of AI because they've been, for instance, a decision maker has been to a conference and heard someone talk and it sounded complex or sounded far-fetched, or you hear about potentially in some industries AI around robots, like warehouse robots and being able to sort packages for Amazon, for example, or pick and pack and that type of stuff, which also involves some AI. But to some degree, I think as we've touched on in previous episodes, we've always, or sorry, in our day-to-day life, not always, recently, have embraced AI without necessarily knowing it by using our smartphones, by using predictive text, by using Gmail. If you use Gmail, you'll know that feature quite well. Um, and driving a car, for instance, if you're using almost all modern cars now have some sort of collision detection system, that type of thing. Even parking sensors to some degree are smart. So, yeah, I mean,
So is it
I
just
guess,
trust, Paul? Does it
yeah,
come
it
down to
is. Yeah,
just
yeah, it is. And what people don't realize is all that stuff that you use every day, like programming I don't know, your smart watch
yeah?
or whatever. It's the same technology. It's just being used for a different purpose. And I think trust comes into it in the sense of we've always done things a certain way. We've always gone and interviewed people, and
Well,
it
so let's
works.
back up for a second. When we think about doing research, and I've got a product. We've talked about different products throughout this series, and I want to now find out, why are people averse to my product? Why are they buying the other guys? Or what do people really want from this thing? I think you've really nailed it here, in that we've got a stable set of tools, and our guests have spoken about this, that we've been using for 100 years,
Yeah,
and we're
yeah.
do you think it comes down to just comfort level? It's
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and I guess it's good to be skeptical. I guess of new technology, and you know you don't want to be. I guess when the investment of some your money changes, you don't necessarily want to be an early adopter for it not to necessarily work out for you, and that's fine, I think. But we're sort of beyond that stage now. I think we're well beyond early adopter anyway, and we're probably still in a very nascent phase of utilizing technology for understanding people better. But yeah, it's definitely a case of that's how I've always done it. Resistance to change, and also not necessarily it's too much to understand. I think for a lot of people, and I don't say that in any way. I'm not being facetious. I'm not being dismissive. Sometimes things are made very technical that don't need to be made very technical. And if you're able to see the underlying data where conclusions have been drawn, And you might have various objections, for instance, for doing this sort of research. And I almost, by the way, guarantee that finance departments in the very same company are using AI to go over daily transactions. They're not. There's nobody there anymore sitting coding manual transactions in a ledger anymore. Like machines do
Mm.
that for us, and that's a given now. That's not even questioned that there's AI technology helping us with accounting, for instance. But
Yeah.
in the consumer insights or research or product understanding or marketing functions, it's still a bit of, like I said, healthy skepticism. But we're moving beyond the realm, I think, of it being an early thing, and being able to embrace the change, but understand the technology is a leap, and it's not a leap that people necessarily need to make. You don't need to know how the code comes up with it. You just need to understand, I guess, on a basic level, how it works and whether it's right for you, and to be able to see the underlying data as well. And I mean, those three things should counter most objections, because I think most market research people, at least that we talk to, have a healthy skepticism of how things have been done forever. So they're
Yeah.
more like, well, we know people lie. Not intentionally, but we know people lie when we ask them questions. We know they don't behave how they do every day when we visit their houses and that type of thing. This is We know that, but there's nothing else. And it's like,
So,
well, there is a technologically advanced way that we can do this. Just like with medicine. I mean, a machine can see a set of X-rays and see a potential, tumor or something like that, or an abnormality, let's say, by itself. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's the same technology, just with a
Paul,
different application.
Paul, in one sense, I'm going back to what Faisal said in a previous episode, and talking exactly like you're reiterating right now, that there's a healthy medium of new technologies and old tried and true techniques being used. I wonder, and I want to stay in this vein for a second. And I know you're saying that that this technology is being adopted by companies, it's being used in a variety of different departments, we're using it every day and we don't realize it. I wonder, when we talk about the uptake of this technology and the use of AI for audience sentiment research, do you think, in a sense, that it's a young person's game at this point? Only in that younger folks who are coming in, so I'm saying in their 20s and 30s, who are entering these departments, they've just lived in this environment, and so they're more apt to not question it and just say it's the way it's always been done. Let's keep going.
Yeah, no, I think so, and I think it's a complex question, because there's organizational barriers, there's also personal barriers, and then there's also previous disappointment. So an example of what I mean by that would be something like a social listening platform where you have to enter the queries yourself. So you have to
Mm.
enter the Boolean style operators, and basically you got to know how to do that to get it right to begin with. So first of all, you got to have an understanding of, I guess, of advanced querying, like and or those types of functions, as well as understanding that you may have inherent biases in the keywords that you select to find the information. I would suggest respectfully to most people who would listen to this that probably 6 out of 10 cases don't work out with social listening because of that.
6 out of 10.
Or yeah,
Be,
it's
be, because
it's what,
because the homework
again, this
hasn't
is,
been done.
yeah, and it's qualitative. There's no quantitative element to that, but there is. It's not the homework hasn't been done. It's complicated. Like you need
Mm.
to understand how a query operator works, and you also need to understand how to spot your own biases, and that you're not using it for confirmation bias of I think because my friends use, I don't know, eggs on their face, that's the
Yeah.
trend, and I should be recommending that to my boss, that we start marketing eggs as a face treatment rather than a food or something. Obviously an absurd example, but I'm just saying
Yeah.
it could be literally three people who have that conversation in your circle of friends, and you suddenly think, oh, that's a trend, and you start to look for confirmation of that. That's the risk of keyword based, those sort of things, and unless you have some training to stop that, or to spot that, not stop that, I think it's impossible to probably stop, but to at least spot that, and also the training to construct these queries properly, then you'll be a bit disappointed. And so I think a lot of the time there's a skepticism towards, for instance, using social as a data source because of that reason. Because I don't know how to use it, it's not working out properly for me, and that's reflective then of all solutions within this space. Do you sort of understand what I mean? You're sort of tarring
Yeah.
everything with the same brush, and I think
Yeah.
that's what happens. So it's not necessarily potentially a youth thing, or at least being a digital native versus a digital adopter versus somebody who started their work before the digital era, for example. Like, I don't think it's as much that, because I think a lot of people, particularly older people, understand that technology enables things that just weren't
Right.
possible before, whereas younger people potentially take it a lot more for granted. So I don't think that's like an enormous barrier, but I think previous disappointment, perhaps with various tools or platforms, does become a barrier and introduces some skepticism, which I say is healthy. I think it's healthy to be skeptical about where the information that you're getting to make decisions comes from and the validity of that. But you also have to trust it when you see it. So it's part of that as well.
How do you talk to people about the fact that you are, by using these tools, you are opening up the potential to be examining an extraordinary number of data points and getting, information, a huge amount of information that other forms of research that one might have in their tool chest, surveys, interviews, uh, you know, observation, much fewer data points. How do you talk to people about understanding that you're going to have to do some work to bring that very large field into a manageable plane?
Yeah, I think first of all that the numbers are beyond sort of some comprehension.
Mm.
So, and what I mean by that would be that, if you're talking about millions of people, it doesn't make it's hard to comprehend. It's a bit like saying, how much does $1 million weigh? There might be 1% of the population who's felt that in their hands before, but nobody else has, right? Particularly,
Yeah.
I guess these days with everything, numbers are on a screen. But what I mean by that is that I think there's a large proportion of people who sort of get to that number and go, "Wow, that's impressive," but how is it any different to 2000?
Yeah.
And that's when you start to say, well, we have to start to look at the data. We have to transform that data. We have to understand it. But what it gives us is a bigger cross section. So you're taking a representative sample of, say, I don't know, 100 people. Our representative sample is a couple of 100,000. We can have a greater degree of confidence in the outcomes. There's not really false positives because we're not sort of dealing with people who answer questions on a professional basis. We're not dealing with people who are acting differently in front of us. In fact, we're observing people over a long period of time. So I think we've touched on historical data, or trended data, as it's called in market research. And that gives you a greater confidence about the validity, I guess, of the numbers and the size of the audience. But it can be difficult to comprehend, a bit like huge numbers that we might read
Mm.
about federal budgets as well. Like the US federal budget is 7 trillion or whatever. Like, what is
Yeah. What
that?
does
Do
that
you know
mean?
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a very similar scenario, I think, when you sort of say to somebody, well, look, we've looked at 240,000 people in this survey. It's like, well, you can't mentally, I mean, that's three
Yeah.
large size stadiums, right? It becomes sort of a little bit impossible to comprehend, but then it gives you that extra degree of confidence about the outcomes and the recommendations, and the actual trends that you're seeing are legitimately there. And that's a huge step.
Is Look, I know in your own organization, you've had clients come and go. You've literally abandoned some clients, or gracefully said, look, we can know we don't need to work together any longer at this point, or etc.
Yeah.
Is there a point with this type of research where, or is there a group who might not actually need it? Or is this type
Yeah,
of research work for everyone?
I think the answer to both those questions is yes. um, so there is a space. So let's deal with the first one first. There is a space, I think, for everybody. It's very different set of circumstances that somebody might use it across different industries. But if you sell anything to anybody, whether that's another business or it's a person, or well, it's only going to be one of those two things, right? It's not going to be
Yeah, yeah.
not going to be a camel or something. But you, if you do those two things, then you can benefit from understanding customer a lot better, and that's a number of things. You need to know who your customer is to sell to them. So it's, I guess, the baseline of selling 101. But also it's about honing your products, understanding if your product has a fit, the market, is there a market there? What do people think of your brand? Brand obviously equals sales. There's lots of things where that's beneficial. And I think that's across the spectrum from somebody
Mm.
setting up in their home, making cakes or selling on Instagram through to multi-billion dollar, sorry, international companies. There is a space for it. That being said, what you spend on it obviously has a very different set of outcomes. And if you don't have the budget, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You should be using the baseline of marketing, the core marketing principles to reach as many people as you can, so people can think about your brand and understand your brand and understand your product and go from there. So I guess if you're talking about people starting out, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but it might also make a lot of sense to do some trend watching. There's a number of good platforms available. I think we've touched on it before. That might be, I don't know, $50 a month or something like that. You could
Yeah.
do that for a couple of months and get some great results and understand what some trends are or some emerging trends that could fit to your market. Also, when you sell directly to people, you have a better idea of what they actually want. So, but when you're talking about shifting cans of soft drink across hundreds of thousands of retailers in the tens of millions in quantity, then you don't have that ability as much. You get feedback, but it's not the same. And then, yeah, I think in terms of who's it right for and who's it not right for, it depends on the organizational embrace of that, to be honest, James. So people have to be embracing technology. It has to be a technology forward organization, because it just doesn't gel if you're I think we can all picture, perhaps I'm going to use a stereotypical example of perhaps a bank or a engineering company or something like that might be a bit more traditional, less digital. The most digital they are is perhaps emails and things like that. And we know there's everybody tries to transform and everything like that, but just some organizations don't have that technology minded. And if you don't, you're going to be probably skeptical of the data to begin with. And that's going to cause problems when you try and adopt it, because you're always going to be second guessing the data and what's in front of you, and you'll go with your own biases and opinions. And so I think it doesn't work in that circumstance. But by and large, it's for everybody. It's just different scales require different things. And if you're starting on your journey, then most definitely I would recommend looking at trends and things like that. But perhaps, a small software as a service type platform that's not going to cost you the earth, just to aggregate trends on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, get an idea of who's buying what where, and close your account and use that knowledge to help hone your messages. And then I guess at the other end of the spectrum, it's about, if you really embrace technology and you're already skeptical of your consumer understanding, then embrace the technology, and that will change everything.
I'm just amazed at how fast this area is evolving. And as we've talked about, just with the Arabic language and going across dialects, and how quickly the technology is learning,
Yeah.
and the ability to give me insight that I can make better decisions with. And as you said, whether it's a mom and pop in the basement or a multi-billion dollar corporation, the entry levels and the ability to scale is is so easy
Yeah.
and
And I
affordable.
exactly. And I think the analogy before, when we were discussing an earlier point about accounting software, it's the same thing. So some of that stuff is built for mum and pops in the basement, to keep
Yeah.
keep track of their sales tax, or keep track of the low amount of transactions that they have, and that's $9 or $10 a month or something like that. And that world was previously unattainable, not even that long ago. So 10 years ago, there wasn't really the software that could just connect up to your bank account, code all your transactions. And most like, imagine saying to a mum and pop business maybe even 5 years ago, look, you can take mobile payments from your phone, from a card payments. The
Yeah.
stuff has just changed immensely, and that adoption of that technology is sort of without question. And then on our side of the fence, I guess, it's a little slower, and that's mostly because, as we've discussed in previous episodes, it's been done this way for generations now. So there's a shift that has to happen, and that shift is very much linked to how technological a company is.
What I find interesting is looking at different companies, and we've talked about this in the past. And in season one, actually, you had a great example of a company who had issues with a product, and you ran an AI model on it and said, "Here's the problem," and they said, "No, it can't be." And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
then
yeah,
they went back and validated your suggestions through literally doing in-person observation, and then came back and said you were right. And
yeah,
I think, to me, that becomes kind of the glue, in that the AI tools can work very well with the traditional tools to add some validation and actually open up the insight, because as you said, their traditional data was all over the place, and they couldn't account for why people weren't buying this product that they should have been buying.
yeah, yeah. And it was, I think, in that particular circumstance, it informed the brief for the traditional research. It informed the brief. It reframed the brief for marketing then to go back and think about the messaging, and how certain things were being talked about, how education was. It just opens up
Yeah,
and tightens briefs, and for the outlay and the costs, the future sales returns become immeasurable against that outlay, if that makes sense. So the small outlay
yeah,
it costs for the insight has an outweighted return in sales, and that just once that's seen, then widespread adoption of technology becomes obviously much easier. There's no barriers, but also, as you say, it just informs more traditional methods to make them tighter, to know where to start looking, and then to make sure that the answers can be validated. And if they are validated, then it's great. And if they're not, then what's wrong, and who's right?
yeah. Well,
And it's a lot easier to work out that way, rather than just hearsay. You've got the data.
yeah. What I find interesting is that if we're talking about sentiment of a user of something, yeah, I can sit and I can watch them. That's usually expensive on my time to then transcribe my observations, put it all together, present it to you. Whereas we've got this great tool that can look at what's going on across thousands of data points via our socials to see, well,
Yeah,
what are people liking, what aren't people liking, why are they liking it, why aren't they liking it, looking at the images, looking at the emojis, and in the case of the Arabic world, playing with the dialects. So
yeah.
suddenly, I mean, it makes me giddy.
And you're just opening a bigger world, and I think that's the most important part of I guess what we're saying is, you can get access to information. Everyone has access to information. What you do with that information and what's next with that information is the most critical part. We've talked about that multiple times. That data is literally information. It's not. It doesn't. It's not an insight until somebody looks and understands and finds the why as to a certain behavior, a certain attitude, a certain whatever it is. The why becomes critically important, and I think that's what technology enables us to do at a much faster speed and a much bigger scale and a much more interesting way, and enables us to know, well, like the title of the podcast, know the audience. And once you know your audience, no matter what you're doing, then you become successful.
I look forward to our future episodes where we're going to sit down and have conversations with people who are using these tools and
Yeah.
talk about the use of the tools in the context of what they're doing. And
Yes.
I'm really interested in what made them jump in. What
Yeah.
what they're getting out of it, how they're scaling, how they're, because to me the biggest challenge becomes, I've now got all this data. Is there do I have information overload, and
Yeah.
how do I know where to scale in that data? And I think talking to people who are doing it opens the door to others who are skeptical, who are on the fence, or who are trying to imagine how this applies to them. And I'm that excites me.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting, and I think, yeah, there's an unlimited potential, and sometimes that's a barrier in the sense that the potential is infinite, so you have to be very focused. But once you know what you want, or know what you need, or know what your problem is, then obviously it becomes a lot easier to solve.
Paul, this has been a lot of fun, and I think we've nicely brought together our two seasons in a sense, with a nice pivot to where we're going to go in future episodes. So
Yep.
I look forward to sitting down and doing more of these. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Really appreciate it.
I'm James Pikeway,
I'm Paul Kelly.
and this is the Know Your Audience Micro Mini Podcast.